Okay, so again, picking up a little bit before where we left off, some organisms or some organs within organisms do not appear to be perfectly adapted. By that we mean, for example, vertebrate eyes have a blind spot in them, and if you were designing an eye, you probably wouldn't design it to have a blind spot in them. And you can do an experiment to look at your blind spot. We can do that in class, possibly. But if you look at other organisms such as mollusks and their eyes, they do not have a blind spot, so they are more perfect. Okay, if we evolved, then it only makes sense that we would have some things that work but aren't necessarily perfect. If we didn't evolve, it would seem like the things that were designed to work would work perfectly. Another example is vertebrae and giraffe necks. So giraffes, of course, have very long necks, and you would expect them to have more or very flexible vertebrae. But if you compare the number of vertebrae in humans in the necks, which is 7, it is the same as the number of vertebrae in giraffes, which is also 7, and same in cats, and pretty much all vertebrates have 7 vertebrae in their neck. And so this isn't a very perfect solution. If you were designing a neck, you would probably design it for giraffes to have a lot more vertebrae. Okay, another anatomical structure are vestigial structures. These are structures that have really no apparent function. For example, humans are able to wiggle their ears. There's muscles there, but it really doesn't do us any good other than some stupid human tricks. You also have hip bones and boa constrictors, but no leg bones, so these are snakes. Humans also have a tailbone, which is, again, serves no function. We don't have a tail. We have no use for a tail. But they are the remnants of evolution of primates in the past that had tails. And also the appendix, which is in the digestive system, but really has little to no function. So these are basically relics of evolution. So at one point, our ancestors had a purpose for these, or a purpose for example, appendages in snakes or whales. But now they have the leftovers, which still make them functional, but are not unnecessary. Another example is biogeography. So that is studying the distribution of species in geographical areas. And when we look at biogeography, we find that areas that have similar selection pressures or similar climates have produced species with very similar traits. So, for example, one of these is a desert in Arizona, one of them is a desert in Africa, and you can see that they are similar in their habitat and the type of species they have, even though the species themselves are very distantly related. And that is because natural selection, if the selection of the environment, which is the natural selection, is the same, then it will produce similar characteristics in the species that inhabit those areas. In addition, this is another kind of redundant argument, but convergent evolution is where you have is the opposite of homologous structures. So these are structures with different evolutionary origin or different morphology, but have the same function. So, for example, the marsupial animals on Australia have placental counterparts in other parts of the world. There is a Tasmanian quoll which is very similar in appearance and in function to the ocelot, though they are not related. There's a flying squirrel, and there's also a placental flying squirrel. There's a marsupial mole, which of course digs, has large front limbs, doesn't have eyes or has very small eyes, and has very developed sense of smell. The mole is designed or it has features that are exactly the same because they live in similar environments. Another example of this is the aerodynamics or the hydrodynamics of fish, sharks, whales, and dinosaur fish. They all have similar body functions with a pointed nose, very sleek skin, a dorsal fin for stabilization. Um, Even though they are not related, dinosaurs are different from fish, which are different from sharks, which are different from dolphins. They're all different, but they have the same characteristics. That's convergent evolution. So one thing Darwin noted that was that island species often do not have many of the species that are found on the mainland, but they could live there if they were introduced. And he hypothesized that the species that are on islands converged or diverged from their continental relatives, and once they get onto the island, they occupy niches that wouldn't otherwise be occupied in the mainland. And so this gives island species um, more freedom, so to speak, to fill different niches. So, for example, this is an island fox, which is actually much smaller and has many features that are different from a mainland fox. This is a gray fox, which is a little bit bigger. But they are very related, but it seems that the fox drifted from the mainland onto the islands. These are found in coast of California islands, and it's much smaller, and it does things a little bit different. They're much tamer. They don't really care as much about humans, whereas a normal fox will run away quickly. And the idea is that, again, the island foxes came from the mainland and then filled a different niche, so they became smaller and did different things than the mainland foxes. So Darwin concluded that, especially in islands that have never been connected to the mainland, the species must have gotten there by dispersing from the mainland across the water. And it's more likely if the species could fly, float, or swim. And once they got there, they were able to evolve to many species because of the niches available. So there are, even today, there are still some critics of Darwin's theory of natural selection, and especially right after it came out, there were lots of criticisms. And we're going to go over 7 principal objections and then the counter arguments to those. So one is that evolution is not solidly demonstrated. Well, that is just false. Although it is just a theory means, like we discussed before, something different in scientific terms than it does in common vernacular. Second, there are no fossil intermediates, and when Darwin came out with this theory, there weren't a lot. But now there have been many intermediates found, including in human evolution. There are a lot. There's also this argument called intelligent design. Basically, that the structures of life are too complex to be random. But the argument against that, well, natural selection isn't random. A desert is hot and dry. It's not random. It has certain selective pressures, but it is not directed, so there is no end to evolution. Another one is that evolution violates the second law of thermodynamics, which you remember was that entropy or disorder increases constantly. But we are an exception to that because we have a constant supply of energy from the sun, and that's what's fueling the system. Proteins are too improbable, so the probability of hemoglobin as a random event would be 1/20th to the 141st power. It's a very, very small actual event, but you can't argue backwards, so it already happened. So the same thing, if you looked at the probability that I was born on the day that I was born, and my dad was born the day that he was born, are very slim, but it already happened, so it's not something that you can argue backwards. The other one is that natural selection does not imply evolution. So just because things can doesn't mean that they did. We haven't evolved a fish into a frog. We can't take a scientific method of selecting. But artificial selection has come very, very has made them very, very diverse species from a single species. So, for example, this cow, you would never find anything like that in the wild, but because of artificial selection, we are able to select for those traits. The last one is the irreducible complexity argument, which is that things such as the human eye are so complex, how could they evolve? And the reason why it does work is because each of the stages in between are also functional. So even very primitive eyes that just have pigmented cells and very small amounts of light can be detected. It still functions even when you get increased complexity. So yes, if you took one part out of an eye, then it would no longer work. So if you took the lens out, it wouldn't work. But over time, you can find these increasing complexities of eyes because they all work in the different stages. Alright, that's all for evolution. Hope you're fully convinced that evolution is a sound scientific theory. Again, most of the critiques from or about evolution no longer really come within the scientific community. There are some things that you could argue here and there, but most of them come as more of a social aspect, and it's usually, it's usually areas outside of science that are arguing against evolution, which is fine. It just doesn't work within the realm of science. All right, that's all.